So we're going to talk about the 7 principles for developing a culture of inclusion. This is your foundational work. So we've spent a good bit of time around numbers 1 and 2, which is cultural humility, cultural curiosity, activating your education around other cultures, and collecting data. If a part of your mission and your work is to serve a particular population, what are the demographics? What is the high school graduation rates for that population? Do they have access to affordable housing? What are the cultural norms of that community? Just getting some baseline data of where they're at in terms of their lived experience. Program outreach and design implementation. Know who to serve, how to find, and how to give them what they need. And I always will say, when we are doing community work, we want to do work with the community, not for the community. So you can research a community all day, every day, but if you don't have members of that community actively involved in the program design or the service delivery process, you may hit hiccups in the process because you don't have the buy-in from the very people you want to serve. And again, that's an example of sharing power, as opposed to saying, I've got this great resource and I'm going to provide it to you. So just the whole idea of being very intentional about engaging the communities that you serve. Again, program management goes right in the same pocket of collecting data. Workforce diversity and competency. Recognize that diversity without competency is not enough. So when we get into, we've talked about it and it's come up, this idea of ally theater, or you have the picture of diversity, but the people that are in the minority feel like they have to assimilate to fit within the culture of your organization. That is probably more damaging than even having them there in the first place. And so really understanding that diversity is one piece of the equation, but also including their voice being heard is equally important as well. And the cost. Just as we put money into strategic planning and our annual fundraisers, if we're serious about doing this work, it costs time and money. Typically, folks that are going through diversity and inclusion initiatives and trying to shift the culture of their organization are in this process from anywhere from 12 to 24 months. And so that's just something to think about, because a lot of people are on the DEI bandwagon now. And what's happening is I've personally gotten requests, hey, I just want you to come in and do one training. I'm like, well, what's that going to do? So really, the training is just the beginning, but you have to have strategy to make sure that all the work you've done in training becomes a normal way that you do business. Everybody okay so far? Any contributions to creating a culture of inclusion? Okay, so I'm gonna keep pushing. And time check, okay. So here are some examples. We talked about actionable strategies. So under each principle, I have some examples of some of the things that you can do. Cultural humility, making training and at onboarding and at least annually for your employees and board members as a bare minimum. Don't just stop at your staff, because depending on how involved your board is, they also shape the culture of your organization. So the board needs to be trained as well as a part of their onboarding. Cultural curiosity, encourage staff to select a colleague that's in the organization that's different from them. What does it look like if the CEO of the organization has lunch with the janitor and they're of a different background, and the power that can come from having these courageous conversations? Sharing cultural practices during holidays. This can be a big issue for people that are in religious minorities. Typically, our society is structured around Judeo-Christian holidays, traditionally, Christmas, Easter. But what if you practice a different religion? Is there opportunity for you to share your experience, and even simple things like having to use your own leave to practice your religious holiday? days? How can you provide accommodation in your HR policies and practices? Talked about collecting demographic data of who you serve, ensure that the staff and board members are aware of that data. Um, we talked about plan with communities and not for them. Possible, if you have town hall meetings, you want to engage a community, particularly working class, low income folks, you can't have meetings at 12 noon and hope people are going to come. Or even in the age of COVID-19, if you have a virtual town hall meeting, consider having it at 6 or 7 o'clock, or electronic surveys of your population. So again, we have to be creative because we're still on pandemic restrictions right now. So I want to offer that as well. Just some other things, program measurement, depending on what your mission is and what your service array is, partnering with a local university, take advantage of evaluators and researchers from a local academic institution to help you. If you want to study who you serve and ways you can serve them better, college students are a perfect resource for you to capture that data. And so here is some other things that you can do. Workplace diversity and competency. We've talked about training, but when we really get into making it our way of doing business, who are your community partnerships with? How do you diversify your candidate pipeline? So historically, if your organization is pretty monocultural and homogenous in nature, how are you diversifying your candidate pool? So one critical thing from an HR perspective that you can do is blind candidate profile. So when resumes come in, have a designated staff person kind of de-identify. So things like a name or where someone school can be identifiers of the community that they come from. So everybody has an equal opportunity to be measured on the same characteristics. And we kind of hack the unconscious bias that we have. So blinding candidate resumes and profiles, but where are they coming from? So we talked about unconscious bias influencing who our networks are. So guess what? In 80 to 90% of the cases, if I refer someone for a job, they're usually going to probably be African American or somebody from my community. And so how do we diversify that? Do you partner with different institutions that serve minority communities, historically Black colleges? What organizations are you partnering with to diversify your pool of candidates? This is a huge one. Most people move up through the ranks in their careers because they had mentorship. Guess what unconscious bias does? It influences who we mentor too. So are there creative ways that you can be intentional? If you're an executive director and you have someone that is a minority in your organization, being very intentional about mentoring that, not that you do that instead of another person, but just being conscious. Am I providing coaching and support to everyone on my team equally so everybody has a chance to be great? In terms of formal mentorship programs, in terms of reaching out to communities that are different from you, creating mentorship programs that are intentional about engaging communities that are different from you. So these are all different strategies that you can use to create a culture of inclusion. And cost. I mentioned before that this work takes time, anywhere a minimum of 6 months, but I've seen some organizations spend anywhere up to 12 to 24 months just working on how they interact with one another and making sure that the policies and procedures of their organization support true inclusion and engagement of minority populations. And I use minority very broadly based on those protected classes. The whole other piece of being very careful about is pay differential. In private nonprofits, you can have people that have, and I know that in my career, I have faced issues where, you know, whether it's male versus female or a employee of color and a person that's not not African American, and same credentials, same education, but this person is making more. Really level, like having some standards in terms of where your program coordinator salaries start, and trying to make it as equitable as possible. Because I've seen and personally experienced things like people, and this is not discriminating against people that don't have a college education, but when you get into situations where the C-suite has less education than the employees that are the foot soldiers, the program directors, it becomes a problem. And it doesn't take long for people to find out that there are inequalities even in pay. So that's something to be cognizant of as well. And sometimes you may not have formal direction in terms of pay scales, and it's kind of loosey goosey depending on how your organization is structured. But as much as possible, making sure that if somebody is a director or above, that they have the minimum qualifications to be in that position, so you don't have somebody that has two master's degrees working under somebody, unless they've founded the organization and there's something to be said for putting in the work. But I've also seen that over my years of working in nonprofits, and particularly in nonprofits, because in government agencies there's a little bit more structure and protection for, you know, moving up through the ranks and meeting a certain minimal qualifications to be in a position. So that's just something to be mindful of as well. Really being intentional about salary transparency, and that for a certain level, this is where we start. And even in the negotiation process, because there's also research that shows that women and people of color tend to ask for less from the outset. So often hiring organizations will justify paying somebody less. Well, hey, they didn't ask for it, so that's why I didn't give it to them. So having a minimum and a range for salary negotiation, and then that's something that we need to work. When I say we need to work on, just this idea from a women and minority perspective, that we have the right to ask for the same amount of pay as male counterparts. And I don't want to put my male family uncomfortable, but it's just the reality. Men get paid more than women. White people in general make more than people color. It's just a reality. So there's responsibility to be borne on both sides to say, you know what, I'm going to go in and ask for what I want. I'm not going to lowball myself. So there's intercultural work that has to be done about us being enough, and really saying for the people that dictate who gets paid, you know what, we're going to be transparent and we're going to really be fair in terms of how we pay people, even within those negotiations. So excellent contribution. So having scripted questions, so we're comparing apples to apples in terms of candidate responses, making sure that everybody is trained. If you are fairly new as a nonprofit organization, one of the resources that I always direct people to is the United Way. They have a lot of resources, so your nonprofit has the proper infrastructure and protections in place from an HR perspective, to make sure that even if you're small, that you are following the letter of the law, and as Chris mentioned, that you're doing as much as you can to protect against bias in hiring practices.